accelerate the implementation of bus franchising powers. This has been lodged by Ellie Harrison on behalf of Better Buses for Strathclyde. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to improve the process for implementing the bus franchising powers contained in the Transport Scotland Act 2019 by introducing without delay the regulations and statutory guidance required to give bus franchising powers full effect, amending the 2019 Act to remove the requirement for proposed franchising frameworks to be approved by a panel appointed by the Traffic Commissioner, instead empowering regional transport partnerships to have the final say on approving proposals, and to providing additional funding to help support regional transport partnerships, RTPs, in preparing franchising frameworks and assisting them with the initial set-up costs once frameworks are approved. And I referred to the galaxy of parliamentary talent that we have assembled, so I welcome this morning Neil Bibby, Patrick Harvey, Mark Ruskell, Graham Simpson and Paul Sweeney, and to say that we had also hoped to have Katie Clark with us, but she's unfortunately unable to attend. For some, Mr Sweeney, it's a return to familiar territory. I think we've had Mr Ruskell at the committee before, but Mr Harvey's first appearance in my tenure at any rate. Well, welcome to you all. Members will be aware that while the Section 38 of the Transport Scotland Act 2019, which makes provisions for local bus service franchising, came into effect in December 2023, the full suite of secondary legislation and guidance for the introduction of local service franchising is not yet in place. In its initial response to the petition, Transport Scotland indicated that a number of substantive regulations have been laid. The remaining regulations and statutory guidance to bring franchising powers into effect will be provided by the end of this year, 2024. The initial response also stated that the Scottish Government has no plans to revisit the primary legislation to remove the requirement for an independent panel to be convened to approve or reject a local transport authority's franchising proposal. As is highlighted in the submissions we've received from the petitioner, while the delay in enacting provisions is, in their view, inexcusable, events have now slightly overtaken us. Members will likely be aware that the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee considered an SSI related to the Traffic Commissioner's role in appointing the independent panel at its meeting on October the 29th and recommended that the SSI be annulled. A motion to annul the SSI was subsequently put forward in the Chamber and was not agreed to. This means that the regulations are in place and came into effect on the 1st of November. During the NZET Committee's consideration of the recent SSI, it has become apparent that the remaining regulations and associated guidance will now be published in the new year. There is a lot of information to consider, which is detailed in our papers for today's meeting, and this includes developments relating to bus franchising in other parts of the UK. We have received a written submission from Paul Sweeney, which was included in our papers for today's meeting. But I'm going to invite all colleagues who have expressed an interest, as I do welcome the interest of parliamentary colleagues in relation to petitions, to address the committee. We thought of having an opinion poll to see which order we would have you all in, but opted ultimately simply to invite you to speak alphabetically. And I know the clerks have asked you, if you can, to complement one another's evidence rather than necessarily to repeat one another's evidence. The committee would very much appreciate that. And I begin with Neil Bibby.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning. I understand you want us to be brief, and I'll happily be brief. I'm very delighted to be at the committee. But quite frankly, I'm also fed up talking about this particular issue, but not nearly as fed up as my constituents in the west of Scotland are about being failed by an utterly broken bus market. I commend Ellie Harrison and the Better Buses for Strathclyde campaign for bringing forward this petition. In the west of Scotland region, as you know, Convener, I represent Renfrewshire, and in Renfrewshire, for example, last year we saw a 13% cut in bus services, a drastic cut that's had real consequences for people in the west of Scotland. Young people in Erskine struggling to get to college, disabled residents in Gala Hill being abandoned, veterans in Erskine without a nearby bus stop. We've got NHS workers from Barrhead and Neilston finding challenges making their shifts at the Royal Alexandra Hospital. Working mothers in Johnston finding it impossible to drop off their kids at school and then get to work on time. And in Foxbar, a dialysis patient is having to take a daily taxi journey now because of early morning bus cuts. All the while, people in Glasgow and the West paying amongst the highest bus fares anywhere in the UK. And frankly, people have had enough. And I think that's why you've got so many MSPs here in front of you this morning. Young people and older people alike are now asking, what's the point in a free bus pass if there is no bus to get on? And these stories are replicated right. I focused on Renfrewshire because I think that's a particular perspective I can offer this morning, convener, but these stories will be replicated across Glasgow and the West. Private bus operators clearly want to keep the status quo, but that's not an option. Reform is long overdue, and reform needs to be accelerated in the ways that the petitioner has put forward. Bus passengers in the West need and deserve change. We've had those franchising powers implemented in places like Manchester and Liverpool and in Leeds, and if it's good enough in those areas, it's certainly good enough for Greater Glasgow and the Clyde. And the process for putting local buses under local control should be accelerated, and transport authorities provided with those necessary resources and information to make that happen urgently, and I welcome the petition.
Thank you, Mr Bibby. I mean, you illustrate your evidence with examples from communities adjacent to my own constituency in Eastwood, where there are similar concerns. I regularly, almost daily, receive representations in relation to the inadequacy of bus services, particularly in what is a growing community that feels it's not well served by these services at all. So I understand the points that you make and invite Patrick Harvey to contribute.
Thank you, convener, and I'm grateful for you and the committee making time for so many colleagues to address you. I think the fact that there are so many of us here should it be the first demonstration to you that the breadth of political support for greater urgency in this area is very, very clear. And I've seen very positive engagement by the campaigners, certainly based in Glasgow, working with all political parties that represent the city, and I think a clear sense of consensus that there does need to be a fundamental change. In fact, the passing of the 2019 Act demonstrates that there is already a clear consensus that we need to be moving in the direction of franchising, that we need to support local areas that choose to move ahead with that. And the passing of the 2019 Act, it was intended not only to make that possible, but to make significant progress toward it. Even when Parliament was considering that legislation, a litany of evidence was taken by the committee at the time during the Stage 1 inquiry, saying that the process, including the panel, would simply take too long. The Scottish Society of Chief Operators of Transport, Glasgow City Council, Strathclyde Partnership for Transport, the Scottish Association of Public Transport, Urban Transport Group, many organisations raised concerns about the timescale that would be involved and the level of bureaucracy and lack of democratic accountability from this process. And the point I would make is that since that time, since that legislation went through Parliament and became an act, we've seen elsewhere faster progress being made than is being made in Scotland. Faster progress elsewhere than made in Scotland, even though we have a political consensus that this should be the direction of travel. So I think it's very, very clear that if we're going to see communities like the one that Neil described and communities right across Scotland benefit from the change that's required, we need to accelerate the process. And if that means the Scottish Government making relatively minor changes to primary legislation, that's what should happen.
Thank you, Mr Harvey. Mr Ruskell.
Yeah, thanks very much. I should say I'm a member of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee, so we've recently been scrutinising the regulations that came to the committee and then were approved by Parliament, but only very narrowly. I think it's important that bus services, which are public services, are run in the public interest. I think franchising is an important part of that, public control that's needed, and that's reflected in the 2019 Transport Act. But I think, as Patrick Harvey's just said, the issue here is that in the years since passing that Act, we've seen franchising progress very rapidly in England. We've yet to see that kind of progress in Scotland, and some of the reasons for that are down to the fact that we haven't had the legislation in place to enable us to proceed. But there are still concerns that the petitioners have, particularly about the process and whether the process of decision-making for a franchise for bus services could be influenced by vested interests. So at the moment, the process that was agreed by Parliament focuses on the role of the Traffic Commissioner. The Traffic Commissioner is appointed by the UK government. It's not appointed by the Scottish government. And it's the Traffic Commissioner themselves who would appoint a panel who would ultimately make the decision. So this is a problem because the Traffic Commissioner's stated objectives are to minimise regulatory burden on operators. Now, if you have operators who are actively frustrating public bus franchising, who are going to court to challenge the process around bus franchising, and yet effectively those interests could be represented in a roundabout way through a decision-making panel, I think that puts it in direct direct opposition to what the Act was trying to achieve, which is more public control through franchising. So originally, I think in the Act, it was ministers who, it was originally consulted that ministers would make the decision around franchising. It's now the Traffic Commissioner and a panel that will do that. So I do think, that this requires more examination. The NZ committee has yet to approve the final piece of legislation in the jigsaw that allow franchising to go forward. So I think there's a moment where NZ committee could look at this issue again, take evidence from the petitioners and look critically at that issue about a potential conflict of interest between the Traffic Commissioner and the panel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruskell. Graham Simpson.
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. It's also my first time at the committee, and it's been fascinating and entertaining. I must come back. Others have laid out the case, I think, for franchising. There are too many areas of Scotland, as you know, Convener, that are not well served by buses. I describe some of these areas as bus deserts. I live in such a place where the bus service is not good enough and leads to many people just using their cars because they haven't got a choice. So franchising has the potential, I think, to provide a solution if implemented. And the frustration that colleagues have already expressed is that in Scotland it's just taking far too long. And I think that's where the petitioners are coming from. So I would merely invite the committee to look at that process, and you might also wish to look at some of the suggested legislation from the new UK government. There is what's called a Better Buses Bill, I think that's the title, and that is going to speed up the process of franchising down south. And I think we need something similar here because it's just taking far too long, and that's the frustration. Mr. Ruskell mentioned quite rightly the recent vote that Parliament had. It was a tied vote, and it went to the presiding officer, and this relates to that undemocratic panel, which could quash any work that's already been done on franchising. The only game in town at the moment is SPT, who cover the area that you cover, Convener. They are looking at franchising. And if they go down the road of doing it, they'll spend a lot of time and money on it, and ultimately they could come up against a three-person panel who could just stop it. And I don't think that's a very good system at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to complement his written submission, Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Convener. Appreciate your kindness in allowing me to speak in addition to my written submission. In addition to what colleagues have already outlined in relation to the dysfunctional nature of the bus network in the west of Scotland, Greater Glasgow area, I'd just like to highlight that control of the fare box is the critical factor in a franchising structure. It is not about nationalising assets of bus companies. It's a red herring to go down that route. So it's about centralising control, public control of the fare box, which allows for rational, coherent management of an integrated bus system and its integration with other transport modes such as rail and subway and so on. So the concern relates to the lack of progress with the implementation of the provisions in the 2019 Act, which is bizarre to us because it's a similar timescale to the UK bill, the UK Act, but we haven't seen implementation happen nearly as quickly in Scotland. One can surmise that it might be that the government were reluctant in the first place to entertain the amendments in the 2019 Act which introduced provisions for franchising, and were therefore not as eager to enact those provisions. However, we are where we are. There is contention over this provision in the bill in relation to the Transport Commissioner's panel having this kind of veto power over democratic decisions made by regional transport authorities on implementation of their preferred structures. So I think there is a question about introducing further evidence to this committee from perhaps the Law Society of Scotland to look at the differences between the UK bill, or the UK Acts and the Scottish Acts, and what could be done to improve them. Perhaps also looking at evidence from SPT, also from the Better Buses for Strathclyde campaign, who have initiated the petition, to get further evidence from them about the nature of their concerns about the legislation. They've certainly studied it in great detail and understand in great depth the issues with it. I would also invite the committee to consider inviting the Secretary of State for Transport and perhaps also the UK Minister for Buses, so Louise Haigh and Simon Lightwood, to offer their view on the appointment of a new Transport Commissioner for Scotland, because that role is currently vacant. And it was certainly advertised earlier in the year, but was disrupted by the general election. So it might be interesting to get their perspectives, given their policy position, on their support for franchising in Scotland and how they might be able to assist colleagues in Scotland in the implementation of franchising through the appointment of a traffic commissioner who would be minded to support such measures.
Thank you very much. Well, a number of suggestions came forward from there, which I think we might want to pursue. We can take note of those from Mr Sweeney and Mr Simpson, in particular in relation to legislation and other matters that are on hand. Colleagues, have we any suggestions for action? Mr Torrance?
Thank you, Convener. I was considering referring the petition to Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee, but gentlemen, you've been so convincing that I would like the committee to continue with the petition. And I wonder if we could consider as a committee writing to 7 statutory regional transport partnerships, seeking their views on the ask in this petition, and also if we would consider writing to Confederation of Passengers Transport, Bus Users Scotland, the Traffic Commissioner for Scotland, and I would also like to, if the committee would write to the B Network in Greater Manchester, in West Yorkshire Combined Authority and Transport for Wales, seeking information on the experience of developing and introducing bus franchising in their areas.
I wonder if we could ask Spice, perhaps, to have a look at this Better Buses bill that's progressing from Westminster, to give us a little bit of information on that. Mr Ewing?
Yes, I'm not familiar with the circumstances in the central belt of Scotland, but certainly in the north of Scotland, many rural communities have no bus services whatsoever. Those bus services in Inverness provided by Stagecoach, the problem hasn't been regulation or otherwise, it's been lack of drivers. And it was a very serious problem. And I have to say that the very detailed exchange that we have in my constituency office with Stagecoach indicated that they went to great lengths to sort that, and they have recruited more drivers. I just thought I'd say that, Convener, because I'm genuinely unfamiliar with the issues that these members, so I defer to their experience. I just wanted to make one suggestion, though.
Potential future career option for you, Mr Ewing.
I suspect not, but definitely not. But I wanted to make one suggestion, which is just for the sake of balance, that we do ask the operators in the relevant areas, the key operators, what their views are, because I think we have a duty in this committee to listen to all sides of the argument, and I would be interested to know what the operator's view is, particularly with regard to the costs of franchising, which I do recall from 20 years ago when this issue was raised in the committee, the Transport Committee, which I was a member of at the time, was a significant factor in the equation, because the costs of running a process are costs which actually could be better perhaps deployed, some may argue, on delivering a better transport system.
I think perfectly reasonable to invite others to contribute evidence to the committee as well. But I think we're going to hold that petition open. Just as a final thought, if any of those who've addressed this morning have got any other suggestions, unusually I might not, but if there are any other things you might like us to take evidence from, I'm quite happy for you just to speak up quickly now. Mr Bibby, did you? No? Nope. So you're quite content? Oh, well,
Just to emphasise the point, Convener, about the UK ministers having input to the
I
committee.
heard that point, yes, that point wasn't lost on me. Parliament is very successful, as you know, at acquiring the contributions of UK ministers, but we may put in a long-term request for that and see what success we have in due course. Maybe it'll be available before Parliament dissolves. In which case, we will keep the petition open. I note there are a number of supporters of the petition in the gallery this morning. Thank you for joining us, and we'll keep the petition open, advance the interests as we've suggested, and move on now to the next and final of our new petitions this morning. Thank you all very much for participating.